In the last program, we looked at the big influence which visiting American and British bands had on the Australian dance music scene in the years 1923 to 1928. In this program, we're going to suggest that the visiting bands didn't have the running all their own way because there were successful Australian bands playing at the time also. Sidney Simpson led a 7-piece band at the Wentworth Cafe in Sydney from 1926 to 1928, and his was the first all-Australian dance band to record in July 1926. This tune is called Freshie.
Nothing but the squirrels hang around him. Why do they all pick on Freshie? At every meal he's a course, he's just the applesauce. They hate him and date him. No matter what they do, they cannot faze him. So why do they all call him Freshie? Because he ain't what he is and isn't what he was.
One local band played so well that it was mentioned in the American Variety magazine in 1927, which considered Jimmy Elkins' band to be the best jazz band in Australia at present. Elkins began playing piano for silent films in Sydney and formed his band in 1924. It mostly worked as the musical attraction at cinemas in Sydney and Melbourne. Like other successful band leaders who were influenced by the Americans, Elkins enlarged his band when he could, in his case to 9 pieces. They made the first electric recordings in Australia for Columbia at Homebush in Sydney in October 1926. This is Jimmy Elkins' Winter Garden Orchestra playing Brainstorm. Elkins Band should be remembered for the potential it held for the 1930s, because two of Australia's best swing bands grew out of it. Elkins' drummer was Jim Davidson, who became leader of the ABC Dance Orchestra. In 1927, Jim Gussie came across from New Zealand to play trumpet with Elkins, and also later went into the ABC Dance Orchestra. Gussie brought a saxophonist with him, Maury Gilman, whose band at the Ginger Jar in 1935 became the nucleus of Frank Coughlin's Sydney Trocadero Orchestra. This is another recording of Jimmy Elkins' Winter Garden Orchestra, with Jim Gussie on trumpet and Jim Davidson on drums, playing Miss Annabel Lee.
Who's wonderful, who's marvelous, Miss Annabel Lee. Who's beautiful, who's lovable, Miss Annabel Lee. Ain't she a pretty baby? What would you give? Just holding her, so forget that she's exclusive. Who's dignified, who's glorified, Miss Annabel Lee. What makes fall, she has it all, just look and you'll see. So you ain't paying me a thing, boy, I'm telling you. Who's wonderful, who's marvelous, Miss Annabel Lee.
Of course, there were other successful Australian bands. On 13 February 1928, Harry Jacobs' band at the Palais Theatre St Kilda combined with a visiting band, Harvey Ball and his Virginians, for the Australian premiere of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, 4 years after Whiteman recorded it. Billy Romaine, who had been in Australia's first jazz band in 1918, led the first all-Australian band at Sydney's Palais Royal in 1928, the Palais Royal Orpheans, who threatened to finally squash the suggestion that you must go to America for a good dance band. Art Chapman played at Melbourne's Rex Cabaret from 1928 to 1933, and this is a recording of that band playing Breeze. Jazz was able to spread worldwide as quickly as it did because of the invention of radio and records. Commercial radio broadcasting began in Australia in 1923. The main difference between programming then and any period since the Depression was that most programs were broadcast live from the studio or from the cabaret in which the band was working. Eric Pearce led the 2FC Studio Dance Orchestra.
We got on the 2FC, that's in the days before the ABC. I fancy it could have been about 1925. We were known as the 2FC Studio Dance Band, conducted by Eric Pearce. We were on 3 or 4 nights, I think it was 3 nights a week, regularly on 2FC. And there was another opposition station, 2BL. On there was Tess Morrison and his Bloom Chasers. Yeah. Through being on 2FC, I used to do a lot of big work in Sydney Town Hall for dancers like the Artist Ball and things like that. I think I did 3 of those. The band on 2FC, first of all, comprised about 5 players, I think, and later I think it went up to 8. What I did that the others didn't do, I did nearly all my own orchestrating.
Yeah. And what did the others do?
By the printed orchestrations. Some of them were printed out here.
Yeah.
Alberts used to bring 2 or 3 numbers every month. So the Allens, they'd have them printed. But when I was on 2FC, I paid for no music. Everything that all the publicists sent me, everything they could lay their hands on. I had hundreds of numbers. But I used to do all my own orchestrating. Take, for instance, Ballarat. Or I told you the other one, Black Shuffle, and others. Or Princess Lesbia's Lullaby. All I would be given would be a piano copy. Sometimes just run on manuscript. And I know when we made Ballarat, there was a hurry for it. And I think I had about a weekend to orchestrate it for a 10-piece orchestra. We'd never seen that thing before. We sat down to record it, and all we do have a couple of goes through and then record.
This is the 2FC Studio Dance Orchestra, conducted by Eric Pearce, playing You've Got to Black Shuffle. Recording began in Australia in 1925 using the pre-electric acoustic method. The first company to record a master, press and retail it was the World Record Company, known as Wocord, in Brighton, Victoria. This firm made the first jazz recordings in Australia, and this is it. Ray Tellier's San Francisco Orchestra recorded in Brighton, Victoria in mid-1925, playing Yes Sir, That's My Baby. The World Record Company was started by a British ex-parliamentarian, Mr. Noel Pemberton Billings. He designed his own records, which were multi-layered cardboard pressed into 1/4 of an inch thickness, surfaced on both sides with shellac. These were issued on the Austral label. Wocord manufactured gramophone and wireless sets and had its own radio station, 3PB, which played its own records. Wocord immediately ran into stiff opposition from other companies which refused to supply stores which stocked Wocord's records. Wocord closed in 1926.
As Wocord closed in Melbourne, HMV and Columbia started with factories in Sydney.
I'm talking now with Mike Sutcliffe, who has done extensive research over a couple of decades now, Mike.
About 30 years, I guess.
Yeah, into the Australian dance music scene. Your speciality is before the Second World War, and also into the recording industry. Can you give us an idea of when records first started to be imported into Australia?
Well, records first appeared in Australia just about around 1890, and up until the first 10 years of the century, they were all imported records. A couple of local cylinder record companies did make some records for a short time around 1908, but there was only less than 100 issues for each of those recordings. Following this, a lot of companies started organising particular records to be made overseas solely for Australian use. One in particular here in Sydney was the Rexophone label, which was meant to be sold with the Rexonola gramophones. That was imported out here by Jackson and MacDonald. But when war broke out in 1914, all these records that were virtually being pressed in Germany, that importation literally stopped overnight.
Right.
So during the World War One, there was virtually no records being brought to Australia, probably because of shipping reasons, would be the main one.
So it resumed then after the First World War?
Oh yes, the Zonophone label would have been about the first after the war, and they would have been the first to bring in records of the original Dixieland jazz band.
And was Zonophone an American or a UK?
No, that was made in England, and the ones that were sold out here were made solely for Australian use. It was a particular series for Australia.
Ah.
But by the early 20s, a lot of American companies were literally dumping their records here in Australia. It was fortunate that we spoke the same language, I guess, because records that had passed their topicality in America, big supplies still left, were being brought out here and sold for down to 1 and 6 each in all types of shops.
So do you think that there was much delay between when a record was recorded in the USA and when it was finally released here in Australia?
I'd say it would be within 5 to 6 months, allowing for sales in America to fall off and then shipping to Australia. But at one stage, the Canadian Compo company was shipping 100,000 records a month to Australia. Following this, the Brunswick company, who had been bringing records to Australia, decided to open a pressing plant in Sydney. The music publishers D. Davis and Company were behind this factory, and they started local pressing by late 1923. And from this Brunswick label that they were able to draw on in America, we get records by Red Nichols and his Five Pennies, Fletcher Henderson's Orchestra, original Memphis Five, and similar bands. And these records would have been one of the major influences of local musicians at that time.
Right, but they weren't recording local musicians
Oh, no,
yet.
no. This was solely a pressing plant. The first recording studio in Australia was in Melbourne, and that was the World Record Company that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
And they went on to record the Burt Rolton Havana Band and the Ray Tellier San Francisco Band.
And then recording shifted to Sydney with the
Yes,
HMV.
when World Record folded in Melbourne, the HMV started in January 1926 with a factory at Erskineville, but again that was just a pressing plant. But by June 1926, Columbia at Homebush had bought the factory site there, and they opened a recording studio, and that they still have the same site today at Homebush here in Sydney. But the recording studio has long moved into the centre of the city. But out at Columbia, a lot of the local Sydney bands were recorded. Al Hammett, Jimmy Elkins, the Palo Roll Californians, they all had several sessions out at the Homebush studios, travelling out there by train. It was very handy for the train station there. Yeah.
Have you any idea how their records, how well they sold?
Not really. Unfortunately, sales figures of those early records are no longer in existence. And as well as the recording studio they had there, they were also importing masters from America and issuing records by the Californian Ramblers and all similar American dance band and hot jazz groups. Yeah.
So there were these two main companies in Sydney. Did they amalgamate?
Not until the early 1930s, and only after the companies had combined in England, and that became known the EMI group of companies.
Which still
they also
exists
took in the
today.
Parlophone label, who had been using the Columbia studios to record locally, and Parlophone was the label that all the Des Tooley records appeared on.
And the EMI company exists today as a major Australian record
Yeah,
company.
well, yes, probably the biggest one.
Were there any other record companies in the 1930s in Australia recording? And
There were a couple more in the 1920s. Vocalion in Melbourne started up in 1928 with several custom type labels, and again they had a recording studio where they recorded local artists and bands. And then in Sydney, the sons of D. Davis started up a company called Clifford Industries, which made a lot of labels for various shops and department stores around Sydney. There was the Embassy record for Coles, and the Gracelon label for Grace Brothers, the Worth label for Woolworths, and these were all sold at 2 shillings each, whereas Columbia and HMV were trying to sell their records at 4 shillings each. So but the quality of these other smaller companies was nowhere near as good as the Columbia group of labels.
Was there any problem with local musicians being able to hear recordings by black artists?
Unfortunately, very little in the way of black artist records were issued in Australia. There was a few in importation of records. On the Banner label there's quite a few Fletcher Henderson orchestras. There's a few blues records that turn up occasionally, but most of the imported records from a jazz point of view are based on the New York white jazz school of thought.
Right. Do you think there was a conscious policy by the recording companies, or they were just responding
I think
to
they were
public demand?
picking popular sellers more than anything.
Yeah.
And you mightn't get too many buyers of Fletcher Henderson Stampede, but you might get more buyers of Yes Sir, That's My Baby, or some such pop tune of the day.
Is there anything other aspect you'd like to tell me about?
Just that the Depression knocked them all out, virtually, apart from EMI. Yeah.
All the small recording
Yeah.
companies got knocked out.
Yeah. And it was left to EMI from 1932 onwards. Yeah.
And they combined their Regal label.
The Regal and Zonophone became the one label.
By 1930, about 50 sides of what is almost jazz had been recorded in Australia. It certainly shows jazz influence in these recordings.
From there we went on to Columbia Records, 10-piece band. There was no electric recording. We played into like little speakers like they used to have on gramophones, that sort of thing. And I remember one of the numbers we played that day was the Prisoner's Song. Some of the records we made were She Knows Her Onions, I'll Never Miss You Again, Matador, My Dream of the Big Parade, Fire, BALLARAT, which was to celebrate, I fancy, the anniversary of the city of Ballarat. It was composed by Jack O'Hagan. Princess Betty's Lullaby, Princess Betty being the Queen. And it was written about the time the Queen Mother and the King, her husband who's now dead, were out here for the opening of Canberra. That was about 27, well, we made the record. Girl of Yesterday, a song written by Charlie Lawrence. Oh Sydney, I Love You was written about the same time as that. Black Shuffle by Jack O'Hagan. Rose Marie, Indian Love Call, Totem Tom Tom, The Door of Her Dreams, Charmaine, and others. Then we were asked to make a record of Looking at the World Through Rose-Coloured Glasses. We recorded it. Before it was stamped out, a matrix arrived from England by another band, so they put that record on the Columbia, and they also made Regal Records. So they put mine on Regal Records under the name of Eric Pearce and his Astoria Band. And on the back of it, they put 6 Feet of Papa.
This is Eric Pearce and his Astoria Band playing 6 Feet of Papa.
5 feet of mama, you get 11, but I get heaven, for the 6 feet of papa belongs to me. If you think I'm lying, just try multiplying 5 feet of blisters times 50 kisses every night. We're rehearsing the answer, you see. I've had sweeties 4'4", now I've got me 2 feet more. Does he thrill me through and through? Why, you can bet your booty do. At 6 feet of papa, 5 feet of mama, you get 11, but I get heaven, for the 6 feet of papa belongs to me.